Hi, Dr. Hart.
Hello. Hi.
Karibu sana. Nice to see you.
Hi, you too.
Yeah. We are looking forward to the presentation quite a lot.
Doc, I'm live.
Any idea how many people might join us?
More than 1,000?
Are you serious?
Yes.
Hi, Liz.
I shall be impressed.
Yeah, more than 1,000.
That'll be tremendous. Gosh.
Yeah. Well, you are talking to healthcare workers, so relationships is a biggie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see you've got 85 at the moment. That's not a bad start at this point.
No, there'll be a lot more as we go along.
Okay.
Yeah. We are also streaming on Facebook Live, so there are other people who are not in the Zoom link.
Right. Yes, I see.
Hi, Dr. Kigondu.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Dr. Haas.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Good evening, everyone. I see everyone is excited. I'd like to welcome all of us to tonight's meeting. We want to thank everyone who is able to join us today. We thank you for continuously joining us and just to keep reminding us that this is healthcare workers for healthcare workers, to ensure that as we go along, we are continuing to take care of ourselves, which is very, very important. And one of the things that we want to say is that we must never be for the longest time. We know that a lot of healthcare workers are taught to take care of everyone. And the question we have to keep asking ourselves then, who takes care of us when we are taking care of people? And this has been an opportunity for us to take care of ourselves. We thank you. And for those who be joining us for the first time, it's for healthcare workers, and it's all healthcare associations coming together from Kenya Medical Association, Nursing Association of Kenya, clinical officers, public health officers, all of us really, and we are leaving no one behind, clinical psychologists and all the psychologists, and we want to make sure that at the end of the day, that after COVID is gone, we will be better people, and we have learned together, we have stood together so that we leave no one behind. And as many of you will remember, is that last week we had a very interesting discussion on relationships. And if you remember very well, Sophie telling us that it's about connections. And as a matter of fact, for us as psychiatrists, every time we see patients, from whether it's depression or psychosis or anxiety or substance use, there's a relationship behind it. So it's true that relationships are very exciting. And before I introduce our guest speakers tonight, I'd like to introduce some of the association members who are here with us. We have Dr. Liz Kayemba. She's been representing the clinical psychologist, and she's done a good job. And Dr. Liz Kayemba, maybe you can tell us briefly about, you say hi, and also remind us about the call center. Dr. Liz Kayemba?
Yes, here I am. Hi, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Kayemba, a clinical psychologist and also chair of Clinical Psychologists Association of Kenya. We are very, very happy, very excited to have Dr. Hart on with us. Welcome, Dr. Hart, once again. And yes, my mandate is also to remind us about the call center. The call center was created with healthcare workers in mind, and we really appreciate so far all the calls that we receive. We encourage and continue to encourage healthcare workers to call in when whatever it is that they may be experiencing, whatever they may be going through, we encourage them to call in and talk to us, even if it's just stress, even if whatever, you're lonely, you're depressed, please call us so we can help, we can support you psychologically. We also encourage you to encourage your family members to call us, because again, relationships is about connection. And if you break, or if the connection is broken, then you cannot work in peace. And right now, healthcare workers, we are busy. We are trying to support our country during this COVID period. So we are experiencing quite a lot of stress, other than, of course, the normal stress that we usually experience on a day-to-day basis, being that we work in the healthcare setting. So Please call us, please interact, please connect with us, and we will support you. Thank you so much, Dr. Koba, and welcome everybody to this very exciting webinar.
Thank you very much, Liz. And we have Sophie Morioki from the same organization, clinical psychologist, and they'll along the way be saying something. We have Jacqueline Nanundo. Thank you, clinical psychologist, for the support you've given us. And then from the Kenya Medical Association, we have Dr. Simon Kigondu, our Secretary General. Dr. Kigondu, you want to say hi for a second?
Hi, and I'm very excited after many years of seeing newspaper articles of a fellow called Chris Hart. We want to welcome him here and hear how his voice sounds like. We know the pen and paper. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Kigondu. Josephine Nohas, who is the Kenya Medical Association Physician Wellness and a leader, and she's the brain behind all these presentations. Josephine, I hope you're in a place where you can say hi, and we can just start us off.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Koba. I'm excited for this session today. After what we saw last week, we thought it best to finish it again this week. So I am really excited. Thank you for the participants joining us today. Thank you to Dr. Chris, to Sophie, to Anundo, to the whole set of panelists. So we are looking forward to learn more today. Karibuni sana.
Thank you very much. And as we start off, I know many of us are looking forward to this evening, especially because we have a very special guest. Of course, all of us are special guests. Please do not forget about that. But in a special way, today we are joined to carry on from where Sophie Morioki, our very own, left us last week. And the most important thing is that we were encouraged and we were reminded that it's about connections and relationships are important. And for this space, we have a guest with us, Dr. Chris Hart. For those of us who've been reading newspapers for the longest time, we know that he's been writing about relationships, and he's a relationship psychologist. He also specializes in training issues of social skills. And so tonight we'll be tapping from Dr. Chris. Dr. Chris, I know this is injustice to the introduction that I could do to you. And I think because you understand yourself best, I'd like to invite you to tell us briefly about why you are interested in relationships. They are very complicated, and where you keep writing about them.
Yes.
Then I can ask a couple of questions.
Okay, can you hear me okay, first of all?
Yes, I can hear you just right.
That's good. Yeah, well, I didn't start off in relationships, it has to be said. In fact, I didn't start off in psychology at all. When I went to college as a teenager, I became an industrial chemist. And I worked in the chemistry industry until about, I don't know, my mid-30s. And then I went back to college and studied psychology. And I spent the next 10 years training. And initially I worked in trauma and violence and victims of crime and things like that. But gradually, people kept asking me questions about relationships. And so very slowly, I migrated into that area. It wasn't a deliberate choice at all. You know how life does that to you sometimes. Anyway, that's where I ended up in relationships. And you're right, they are complicated.
Great, it's true, they are very complicated, and today learning, we want to learn how to make them less complicated. And so, like I indicated earlier, we have very many questions that we were asked last week, and Sophie answered 1,000 of them, and she still didn't answer all of them. But maybe you want to start by maybe your own reflection. I know Sophie gave us a good presentation of what COVID could have done to the relationships, issues of some people having to stay too long together and they were used to not being together and things like that. In your own opinion, Dr. Chris, how do you think COVID-19 has affected our relationships?
Well, it's a very interesting question because it's affected them both positively and negatively. I mean, I meet people who actually made lifetime decisions as a result of COVID. You know, they suddenly decided to bring everything forward so that they were together rather than separated by COVID restrictions around the world. Other people, on the other hand, have found it highly stressful. So, for example, I think I am definitely seeing a lot more clients as a result of COVID than I was at an equivalent time last year. You know, this time of year is bad news for relationships at the best of time. You know, it's the peak of the divorce season after Christmas. But this year, I've had far more interest in counselling, and that's because people, as you rightly say, they've spent more time together, the families all together, they're working from home like as not. All of a sudden, a lot of relationship issues have come to the fore. On the other hand, as I say, other things have happened in the right way. I mean, a very good example is people who are dating. It used to be that the dating process through dating apps had become rather sordid. You know, it had become a hookup process. But suddenly, people meeting online, instead of going and hanging out in some bar together, they actually start video chatting. And before you know it, they're actually having a proper, respectful, good conversation between themselves online. And long before they meet one another in the flesh, so to speak, they've come to know one another very well. And so that side of relationships has actually prospered under COVID. I know that sounds a bit weird, but that's the way it is. So it's swings and roundabouts. Some things are good, some things are bad.
Great, and I don't know whether Sophie, in your practice, you've seen that the negative bits. Are you seeing more patients in your clinical practice now that Dr. Hart is agreeing with us that some people have been affected positively and others negatively? Are you seeing that in clinical practice as you practice in Kenya?
Definitely, I concur. I am seeing similar changes, more so the negative impact. I'm finding particularly the men have reached out more than the ladies, and they're struggling with different relationship issues. You'll also find the children are being affected, so that's another dynamic that I'm also finding that has reached out for support. In terms of issues to do with domestic violence as well, or intimate partner violence, that has also been a theme, I think, for lack of a better phrase, that has been evident in the last few months, yeah? That you're finding a lot of couples are not able to regulate their emotions well, they're not able to manage their stress as well, and their anger management skills are maybe, they need more support in that area. So you're also finding that the cases of intimate partner violence have gone up. So yes, I do concur. Even for me, it's the same thing, that I'm seeing more clients now in terms of relationship stress.
Yes.
Thank you. And so coming back to you, Dr. Chris, because of these conflicts that may have risen, there's a concern that there have been heartbreaks because either people didn't agree to continue living together, or because they spent so much time together during this season. And one of the people who asked the question was asking, how do you just handle this heartbreak, that the heartbreak has happened and you want to move on, but you are continuously, the thoughts of the pain and what is happening because of the heartbreak, not specified the reason for the heartbreak, is persisting. How do you assist such a person to move on?
Yes, I mean, it's always difficult when a relationship ends, even a bad one. Even when a really bad relationship ends, people still have those heartbreak moments. Unfortunately, there really isn't much that can be done. The fact is the brain insists more or less on going through a sort of loss process after any bad event in our lives, and relationships more than any other. And so really the most that people can do is to accept that they're going through it, is to accept that they will have a lot of intrusive thoughts, a lot of the sort of things you hear about in grieving, like they'll have moments when they think they can put the clock back, or they do what ifs, they blame themselves, they blame God, they blame their partner, they get into denial quite often, they get depressed. You can talk with them about this, but the fact remains that the brain more or less insists that it has to go through that process. So what I tend to say to people is just accept the emotions as they come. If they are excessively intrusive, then just say to yourself, okay, I'm going to think about this for a few more minutes, and then I'll think about it again tonight when I get home. You'd be surprised how that stops intrusive thoughts for a few hours. Obviously, one of the best things you can do is to be with your family and talk with people you know and trust. If that's not possible, then maybe you can reach out online to them or to a professional. But one way or another, I hate to say it, the heartbreak, you have to endure it. The good news is, of course, it does end. And so you can say to people that gradually the feelings will get less intense, and there'll be moments when they are much lighter. And then you'll gradually realize that the lighter moments are beginning to predominate and the darker moments are less troublesome. And then slowly you'll realize you're coming through it. But there's not much you can do about it. You can't avoid it.
Thank you. And then that reminds me of a saying that heartbreaks or whatever emotional injury is like a physical wound. And
Yes,
time
absolutely.
over time, so that it hurts the most when you're going through the bleeding and the pus formation, just like any other physical wound. But with time, it heals and you look at the scar. So for those who may have gone through the heartbreak, it's encouraging to know that there's hope. However, there's someone who was saying there has been heartbreaks and they are not living. The relationship, they are married and they are not living, like leaving the house. They are staying in the same house. And they are staying for years without touching each other. There's someone here who was saying they had, after the breakup or after the disconnect because of what was thought to be unfaithfulness, for
Yes.
about 3 years now, the couple cannot sleep together. And this was because of cheating. The heartbreak was because of cheating. And the husband never apologized. And the husband, 3 years on, around, not talking to each other, having different bedrooms, and they're wondering, how can they deal with this? Because it's stressful and they don't know how to go on. What would you say, Dr. Chris?
Well, I think a situation like that shouldn't be allowed to continue. I mean, if it goes on for years and years and years, then eventually you'll get to a place where you'll have enormous regret for all that wasted time. So the couple really does need to sit down and decide what they're going to do. They can either, of course, agree to split up, or they can agree to reconcile, but they mustn't stay in the middle in this no man's land. So if they can't come to terms with either of the two alternatives, they need to get some professional help to help them take the decision. The worst thing you can do in life is to be indecisive and to stay in these no man's lands. People do, I hate to say it, and they do it for years. And I've known people do it for 20 years. Now, you imagine how you'd feel 20 years later if you look back and you think, gosh, I've wasted the last 20 years when I could have been somebody who made me happy. So you mustn't do it. You must make a decision to move on. Now, it can be very hard to come to terms with something difficult like an infidelity. And it may not be possible, in which case the right thing to do is to start thinking about leaving. But if at all possible, you want to be able to discuss everything that happened, forgive each other, because both are going to have been involved, and find some way to move on and forgive. But it can be hard.
Yeah, and very closely related, there's someone who's saying it's been 9 years and they have decided to leave and they have no idea how to initiate that process because they feel like they have done their best and the gentleman is not making, unfortunately, it seems to be gentlemen being accused. Today, gentlemen, we are not against you, we are just answering questions. and they're saying 10 years and they've decided to leave, but they have no idea how to go about the leaving other than talking.
Yes, I mean, look, that's a very important point you're making. People tend to think that leaving is something you just decide to do and then you do it. Actually, no, it's quite a process. And people who don't go through the process don't leave. So the process is about imagining the world that you're going to inhabit when you've left. So you start thinking about the concrete things you're going to actually be doing in your new life. So you start imagining where you're going to live. Are you going to change your job? What are you going to tell your family, your children? How are you going to interact with each other? You try and make all this as concrete as possible in your mind as you prepare to move out. Whether or not, of course, it's you who moves or your partner who moves, eventually that's going to result in a long series of discussions and maybe quite a lot of acrimony. And so again, you might find yourself needing to involve a professional to try and break the logjam so that people really start talking constructively about the future. But 9 years, I mean, that's a long time. You know, you should not do that. If you're in one of these situations which just is stuck, you have to get on, you have to move on.
And maybe Sophie could also share with us, have you had to deal with someone who you had to assist to leave, especially in clinical practice? People who, because this lady says 9 years and she came and she was your patient. How do you go about helping her in clinical practice?
Well, I usually start by asking her to imagine what she's going to feel like if this goes on and on and on and on. Eventually, she's going to be a little old lady in her 70s and 80s, bitter about her wasted life. So I start by trying to say to her, you have to find a way forward that results in you leading a fulfilling and happy life. Now, of course, I'm not in a position to make a recommendation as to what that should be. That's a decision only she can take or he can take. So the next phase is to ask them to think about the two alternatives, the reconciling and the moving out, and start to weigh up the pros and cons. I often ask people to work on both possibilities simultaneously. So I say to them, start thinking about moving on and all that that entails, the process of leaving, as I just described. But at the same time, start talking to your spouse and saying, look, we really ought to try to talk through all the issues that have arisen between us. Now, one of those two things will happen. And so you've created for yourself a sort of win-win. What you mustn't do is stay in this never-never land in the middle. So what I do is I try, as I say, to persuade people to think about both alternatives and work on both alternatives and make them real. And one of them will work out and the other one won't.
Thank you, Dr. Chris. Sophie, what has been your own experience in preparing people to leave, if at all?
That's sometimes a concept that people find even hard to anticipate, or even to digest the fact that you can live well, like live a relationship well. I think the other angle I also look at over and above what Dr. Hart has mentioned is sometimes even looking behind just to get some insight and perspective into a situation helps. So then, what is it that you're unhappy with in your current relationship? What kind of relationship do you have? Have you enjoyed it? Just a reflection of where you've come from. Because then sometimes we also need to look at the maladaptive behaviors that maybe we've adopted over time. So you could very well find that one individual comes in blaming the partner, but then after having conversations, they get insight into their own behavior, perspective into their own contribution to this situation. So then they walk away thinking, okay, maybe actually, I could have done this better. I could have, watched how I communicate better, whatever the issues are. And that also helps them. Once they leave the current relationship, then at least they've left with learnings. So they know not to repeat some behaviors in another relationship or not to repeat mistakes. Because then it takes two to tango in a relationship. It's not always one person to blame. So, looking at what is your own contribution to this situation is another angle that we look at. Sometimes even it's worth looking at your own emotional background, how you grew up, how are emotions displayed in your own family of origin, that kind of thing. Because maybe we have childhood trauma that we've carried forward into our current relationships, previous baggage. So getting an understanding of all that is something that we also look at in clinical practice.
Thank you very much. And in this difficult, again, we are sticking with the difficult relationship and wanting to leave. And there's a conversation that came out very strongly about narcissism. So maybe back to Dr. Hart to tell us, who are these narcissistic spouses who are being described? And how do you deal with them? And someone was saying they have a partner who is always critical, is contemptuous, always defensive and uncooperative. And the reason they want to leave is because they believe they have already labeled them and narcissistic. Do these narcissists exist, and what can be done about it?
Okay, now you've actually talked about two different things in that question. That cycle you started to describe, where people get critical and contemptuous and defensive and so on, is a process that people go through as relationships begin to fall apart. It's an almost I nearly said it's very common. It's almost universal that when a relationship comes under strain, ordinary conversations start to have first a critical edge, and then some rude words start imposing, and then people get really defensive. And that's not because they're bad people or there's a personality disorder or anything like that going on. It's just what people do when a relationship's beginning to fall apart. And that's something people can consciously control. When they are facing one another, they need to think about the form of language they're using and to try and avoid critical words, try and avoid being contemptuous, try and avoid being defensive and so on. And it helps enormously if people just think about the way they express themselves in a discussion with a partner. Now, the other thing you mentioned, of course, personality disorders. I mean, everybody tends to latch on to narcissism because it's forever in the newspapers. But of course, in reality, there's a whole raft of personality disorders, and they are all a total nightmare in relationships. If your partner, if you are, let us hopefully say, if you're dating somebody who's got a personality disorder, you need to pick that up pretty swiftly. And the moment you begin to realize that you're with someone whose behavior can be weird, one of the first things that should go through your mind is, hang on, is it possible that I'm with somebody who's got a personality disorder? And the reason why I say that is because, broadly speaking, people with personality disorders refuse treatment. They're a little bit like the alcoholic who's in denial. You know, I am not an alcoholic, I'm just a social drinker. And you can see that they're not. The same thing happens with personality disorders. They see the world through their lens, their personality, and they're happy with it. And they think everybody else would be like them if they had the opportunity. And that's particularly true with the group of odd behaviors of personality disorders. They all think their odd behavior is the dramatic behaviors, the narcissists, the histrionics, the psychos, for want of a silly word, but you know what I mean. They all think the way they're behaving is okay. They create mayhem around them. So if you begin to realize that the behavior of your partner is really odd, you should think about personality disorders, and you should get some professional advice as to whether it's worth continuing.
Thank you, Chris. And maybe Sophie, as a clinical psychologist, can also weigh in and tell us, do you find when you're treating people, some of the problems that people are bringing to you is because of narcissistic spouses? And how do you handle them practically? What would I expect if I brought to you my narcissistic husband to your practice?
Wow, how much time do we have? Because
no, just briefly, very briefly. What do you do with them? Because we want to know.
Yeah, it's true. But you see, the thing is, you have to be ready to put in the work, right? Because we need to unpack that and find out. I mean, for you to even come out with the term narcissism, I mean, an assessment is needed and that kind of thing. So that's where we start, if it applies. So again, looking at background and any other underlying psychological issues, what kind of symptoms are they presenting with? Then, so that we can actually say, fine, maybe this is a personality issue, or maybe it's just a poor coping skill issue. But in order to make that distinction, then we need to go clinical, so to speak. So the first expectation for me, an open mind. Come open-minded, so that we can now tackle this together and walk this journey together to see how to best serve both partners within a couple. But yeah, as in with personality issues, it tends to be a bit hectic. But then also we don't want people to walk away feeling discouraged. I think the take home for that question is seek professional advice, because then it's a case by case sort of situation. Instead of giving a blanket answer and then someone walking away with that saying this is what will work, it's a case by case, and the best thing to start with is seek professional advice. And once you're there, go open-minded. Yeah, because then are you in this for the long haul? If your partner is actually struggling with a personality disorder, then they need your support. And are you prepared to take this on and walk this journey with them and learn how to support your partner well? And also for you in turn as a caregiver, in this case, then you also need your own support. So then how do we work around that so that both parties walk out of that room feeling heard and attended to, and feeling that, okay, my spouse is going to get some help, but so will I. So I think those are some of the expectations and one would have in mind when they come in.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point you're making, that really people need to seek professional help, because what I've seen like on social media is people laboring and non-professional giving ideas about what the spouse could have. But I think what you are telling us is that people need to seek help so that it can be clarified whether it's a personality disorder and that person can be helped. Because I'm not sure whether the answer to everything is leave, as social media would be describing. So thank you very much for that point. So there are very many questions coming in, and for those who are lifting their hands, kindly put your question on the question and answer. Then we will try to quickly answer them as they come in. So for Chris, what happens in cases where a woman wants to leave but is a housewife, wants to leave but has no means to support her kids if she lives with her children? Can courts compel husbands during period of separation to support their kids? Chances are he'll fight to get her back, to get them, because he can financially support them. What do you think?
Well, obviously, if a separation does occur and it's, shall we say, contested, then it is likely to end up in the courts. So one of the first things a woman should do if she thinks she fits in that category is to consult a lawyer. And I know this sounds a bit wicked, but she needs to think for a little while before she does that. Gather some data, if you like, about her husband's income, their property and assets and so on, so that she can describe the situation to the lawyer and then ask what their strategy is going to be in terms of getting child support, maintenance for herself, and so on and so on. Until a few years ago, this was a really difficult area. The courts weren't a great deal of help, but with the change in the law a few years ago, the new Marriage Act, the courts have been very helpful, and especially just the simple fact of getting support for the children is now relatively straightforward. I'm not sure that I'm not saying that makes it easy. It doesn't, but it is much more possible than it used to be. And so the first step is definitely to involve a lawyer and say, I need support. If I start to think about moving out, I need to know how that process is going to work and how quickly I can get support, and take it from there.
Wow. And I think what you're saying is that there must be a pausing to ask yourself, what will be the consequences of living with these children, so that we're not just waking up and rushing. And I used to see that in the village, where a woman just wakes up one day, packs a gunia, like a sack of clothes, and the next day they return. And I'm sure that's not the kind of thing we want, that every so often you keep leaving and coming back. And I think it's an important point you're making, that you need to ask yourself, where are you going and what does it take and what will it cost you when you go out there? And maybe speaking closely there with divorce, there's someone who's saying, my 4-year marriage ended when my wife left. She never reached out to her family or mine to explain that what she was not happy with, though she suspected I was being unfaithful to her. So people are sharing, and thank you for sharing. I don't know whether you want to make a comment on that. But the continuous statement is that all my efforts to reconcile to our best couple never bore any fruit. Now, years after our separation, I decided to file a divorce. And now she's all over asking that we talk. Is she being genuine? I'm not comfortable allowing her back to my life. Please advise. Dr. Chris, you advise this one. the wife suddenly just after the divorce, I think probably the fear that is finally coming to an end. Now she wants to talk about it. Should he talk or should he continue with the divorce?
I think especially where there are children, the answer is always to talk. I mean, the plain fact is, if a man and a woman get together and have children together, regardless of the legal status of their relationship continues for the rest of their lives, because they're going to be standing at weddings, watching their children get married. They're going to be at christenings and whatever. You can't escape from the fact that when the children are involved, the relationship between that man and that woman continues all their lives. So at the very least, if you do decide to separate, you need to find a way of making it into a business-like arrangement, one in which you cooperate and co-parent and do your best for the children, regardless of how you might feel about each other. You need to do it the best you can for your children, because they still love you both. You know, they love their fathers, they love their mothers, even though those people have maybe or maybe not done bad things. The children still love them and still need them. And so, yes, you should always talk, always. It can be hard sometimes, you know, people can be really bitter. And the sort of situation you describe where a couple separate and then years later the legal process starts and all of a sudden they come rushing back, that's very common. That's exactly what happens in a lot of cases. But it shouldn't have got that far. What should have happened really is, as soon as the couple realize they're unhappy, especially if it's getting to the point where somebody's thinking about leaving, then start to talk. What have you got to lose if you start talking? In fact, one of the situations I most dislike hearing about is the one where somebody leaves and then refuses to talk for ages. And that's really deeply unfair to everybody. If you're so unhappy that you feel you need to leave, say why. Talk to your partner about what the issues are and start to try at least to put them right. If you don't succeed, you don't succeed, but at least everybody feels they've been listened to.
Yeah, and there's someone who is asking, for those who choose not to talk, is it a personality disorder? Why do they choose not to talk instead of speaking out what they have? They retreat and keep quiet, whether they be away or within the marriage, they just keep quiet. Is it a problem, do you think?
Now, this is going to sound a little bit unfair, but the most common reason why somebody refuses to talk is because they are afraid of their partner's reaction. I mean, think of a trivial version of this. I'm thinking as I go home from work about telling my wife something, and then it crosses my mind that if I do raise that subject, she's going to give me a hard time. Now, instantly, I'm going to change the subject. I'm not going to tell her what I plan to tell her. And the same is true if I'm in a relationship where things are going wrong, whether they're small things or big things. If I know that talking about them is going to be painful, I'm just going to leave things by until eventually it may have been years and I've been putting up with it, I've not raised it, and it's all ultimately because my partner gives me a hard time if I raise it. So if you like, one of the most important social skills couples must learn is to listen to each other without judgment and without giving each other a hard time, because then, doesn't matter what the problems are, you can generally solve them. But if you react when your partner raises something by giving them a real hard time, then they'll stop talking.
And I'm just wondering, Dr. Chris, how do I learn how to communicate without judgment? Is there like a book to read? Is there what? Because I think it's great. And I think
there are thousands
Yes.
of books on the subject, I hate to say, and most of them are simply dreadful. It's not as complicated as it sounds. I mean, if you just put yourself in your partner's shoes, if someone is trying to tell you they've got a problem, and all you do is you start giving them heavy advice and you start shouting at them or something like that, it's not going to work, is it? So just think how you would like to be treated if you were trying to explain a difficulty to your partner, and then do that in return to your partner. Just the simple fact of listening with an open mind can actually totally change relationships. I can think of no end of cases where a partner has suddenly had the insight that if I just listen to my spouse, I might learn something. And if nothing else, they will feel that I am paying them the right sort of attention. And you restrain yourself from doing all the usual things like heavy-handed advice and all the rest of it. And at the end of the evening, your partner is saying, gosh, I feel so much better, just feeling that you understand what I'm going through. So I know it sounds a bit simplistic, but just keeping your mouth shut and just letting your partner speak and not rushing to leap in with your rejoinder or your advice or what have you is really all you need to do. The most important thing is that when your partner's speaking, you should try and understand them rather than try and solve the problem. And the solve bit usually involves you justifying yourself. Don't do that. Try and understand what's going on in your partner's mind, and then your relationship will get a lot better.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Chris. You know what you're saying, that we should listen to understand. We should seek to understand whatever our spouse is saying before we respond, or before we because sometimes one of the mistakes we make is that you begin to formulate the response before you even understand what is being said. And I know that's for many of us, that we first listen.
Oh, it's the commonest it's the commonest example of a poor social skill there is, isn't it? We don't listen to understand, we listen to reply, and that's not a very good idea.
And I know there is an altar call for confessing. Many of us would be guilty that you have a response even before the statement is completed, and you wonder what you are responding.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
That's awesome. So there are people who they keep quiet, they have considered leaving, but they don't leave. And one of the reasons that they're not leaving is because of children. And
yes.
I just like to hear so it's broken. We are not talking and it's not working, and we tried our best, but there are children. Is it wise to just stay because of these children, or should we do what?
Look, all of these problems are like on a spectrum. Some problems are relatively simple, some are exceedingly deep and difficult. So the first thing you need to do is to try and decide how serious your problems are. And as you begin to form a judgment on that, you find yourself either towards the leaving end of the spectrum or the solving end of the spectrum. Now, in a perfect world, of course, you solve the problems and you live together happily ever after, and the children are happy. But maybe you're in a relationship which is really very unhealthy, abusive in some way or other, or what have you. You must not stay in a relationship like that. So if you begin to feel that a separation is the only solution, then the next step is to start thinking about everything from the point of view of the children. It is much better for a couple who have separated to be good co-parents than for a couple to stay together and fight. I mean, a world in which the parents are fighting is hell on earth for children. So if you can find a way with your spouse to separate and become good co-parents, look after your children and put them first for the rest of your life, then that is going to be the better solution. Now, I'm not pretending co-parenting is easy. In fact, it gets very complicated eventually, because usually what happens is both parties move on, they find new partners, they start having more children, they bring stepchildren into the equation. Life can get seriously complicated. But having said that, a couple who determinedly try to behave in the best interests of their children will usually end up doing a very good job. And I can actually tell you stories of couples who have been hugely successful doing that. Couples who are distinctly, desperately unhappy together, suddenly discover they are good friends and parents when they're not living together. And that's where you should aim to be if you are going to have to separate.
Thank you, Dr. Hart. And I want to ask you, Sophie, I know you see children also in your practice, and I wonder whether there's help for these children, especially when parents are not communicating. What are the challenges that these children face, and how can we support children when they are caught in between these relationships?
I mean, I think Dr. Hart was spot on. And I think an easy way to look at it is children watch their parents like we watch Netflix, right? Like this. And so then in a situation where there's intimate partner violence, there's abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, what are they seeing? What are they being exposed to? Because then this is where they're learning. So what are we in turn teaching them? What are they being socialized to do? How are they learning to behave in relationships? And so when they come in and we find out what the issues are, we have to rope in the family, whether it's the parents they live with, whoever their caregiver is, and whoever else is within their little community or their little village, because it does take a village. And you see, the thing is, if this is what they're watching all the time, so what kind of adult do you expect that they'll become? So we need to support them in that regard. We need to then break it down for the adults to say, look, this you guys are having this issue, and that's fine, but then it's affecting your child in this way. Breaking it down to them into the reality of it is what counts. And also you have to factor in the age of the child, because then depending on whether they're an adolescent, a young child, then you're able to understand the ramifications of that. But you see, once they've been brought in for support and we can intervene, then there's always hope. And even if you're not there yet, or they're not ready to have that therapy, then family systems can be brought in, supportive family members, supportive family friends. There are families who have better friends or friends who become family. Rope in the support that you can to help you. But then at the end of the day, living in a situation where 20 years in, you're just at each other's throats, then your child has grown up in a hostile environment for 20 years. So then even they will learn that is how I'm supposed to communicate with my boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse, whatever the case may be. And then you're just creating another future client, you know what I mean? So then why not curb it, nip it in the bud, and we just try and create a more positive environment for everyone involved.
And I think
right.
There must be a way of protecting the children. We are not saying you must stay for the children, but you must protect them, because somehow if you don't, then unfortunately it's a vicious cycle of emotional distress. And for especially those of us who are practicing psychiatry in Kenya, you'll confirm that there are so many children you see, whether they are taking substances or they are depressed, but when you look at the genesis of their problem, is that there was a relationship that was not well handled. So I think we need to be careful so that at the end of the day, whatever distress we are going through does not affect generations to come. So thank you. So many questions coming in. And then Dr. Hart, someone is asking, how do you deal with a partner who always plays a victim and never apologizes for a mistake committed? Right now, we have never talked for the past 1.5 months.
Right. I mean, this is a strategy that a lot of people adopt. They clam up, they don't talk, they sulk, they, as you say, they play the victim. I mean, clearly that's not a productive way to discuss a conflict. So the most important thing, I know this is going to sound a little bit weird if I say it too quickly, but the first thing to do is to try and separate the conversations you have with your spouse in this sort of situation into the good conversations and the bad conversations. Most of the time, a couple ought to be having a simple, enjoyable conversation about practical things like what are we going to have for supper and who's picking the kids up and so on. Stuff that you can do with a smile. And then you should expand that a little bit to being nice to one another, reminding each other of why you got together in the first place, so that you begin to reflect on the good side of your relationship. And then at some appropriate point, you say to your partner, look, you know, we were having a bit of a row about something. Can we set a bit of time aside to discuss what was going on there? And the point is, you don't ambush your partner with this conversation. You say to them, let's have a conversation. And you agree together what the conversation is about. You create a little agenda and you give each other 24 hours notice or something like that, so you can both get ready and prepare. And then you hold that conversation in a business-like fashion. In other words, don't hold that conversation in one of your intimate spaces, like the bedroom or the sofa or the kitchen or your favorite restaurant. Agree that you're going to do it at something like, I don't know, the dining room table, hard chairs, hard surface, pad of A4 paper, a cup of tea and a packet of biscuits. It's suddenly a business meeting to solve a problem. So now you can sit there like two calm, prepared adults and start talking about a problem that needs to be solved. So if you can get people to start separating the nice side of their relationship from the problems, then suddenly they start to see the problems as something to be solved rather than somebody to be hated, if you see what I mean. So that is broadly speaking how I generally approach situations like conflict situations like that, is to get people to start thinking about solving problems.
Yeah, and I think it's a very important point that you have to make time to talk. And you have to talk like adults and try to solve the problem as opposed to fighting and blaming each other. However, yes. Chris, I don't know whether you've interacted with these people who just won't talk. So that even when you put the biscuits on the table, the conversation would just happen. How do you, yeah, or something that can help people learn how to.
Yes, I do know what you mean. But I mean, look, most of the issues surrounding that are about this problem of ambushing. Men in particular hate being ambushed. I don't know if you've ever watched young kids in the schoolyard. The boys give each other a really hard time. And so boys, socialize each other to be careful about being vulnerable. Men live in a highly competitive world, and they try to avoid being on the back foot. So if a woman, and it's usually the woman, says, we need to talk now, he will not talk. He'll think of every excuse in the book not to talk. He'll either clamor, he'll get angry, he'll leave, there'll be a storming, the doors are slammed. Number one is no ambushes. Because if you say to your husband, to your partner, look, we need to talk about this. Can we just agree what the issues are? And they're written down. You've got an agenda, and you give somebody 24 hours to think how they're going to approach them. You'd be surprised how often people come and say, yes, I've been longing to talk about this. Get the ambush element out, and that will make a big difference. The second problem is that in most cases where there's a big issue going on, people have been trying to raise the subject for ages. It keeps coming up. Every time somebody opens their mouths, the conversation drifts into this conflict. Now, I think you can see how if all the time I'm with my partner, I'm scared to death that this subject is going to come up again. People need some respite from that. They need to feel that if there isn't something in the diary, if there isn't a meeting in the diary, then tonight is just going to be a nice evening. And so it's actually really important to spend some of your time together, most of your time together, talking about nice things. And then people start to be more willing, if they're not ambushed, to talk about the tough stuff. Okay?
Wow, I feel like many of us need to be taught, especially how to restrain ourselves. It's Valentine's evening or something. and instead of just having a good time, you bring a complaint and it's done. The rest of the conversation doesn't happen. And I know many of us are kids with that. So I think we are learning, and I hope, and thank you for continuing to share with us questions. And I just want to move us to another area that has quite a number of questions on unfaithfulness. And just to start on this, where someone says, how do you manage being attracted to other people while being in a relationship? How do you deal with wanting them more than your spouse?
Sorry, could you just ask that question again? I didn't quite understand it.
How do you maneuver being attracted? So this guy or someone is being attracted to other people, yet they are in a relationship already, and they want them more than their spouse.
Okay, look, I mean, there's two things here. One is that we as human beings are attracted to other people, whether we like it or not, all our lives. Whether we're in a relationship or not, you can't stop yourself looking at another sexually attractive person and feeling something for them. That's just a part of the way life is. So when you think about making a commitment to somebody, one of the things you've got to decide is that even though you feel those attractions, you are going to put them aside. It's a conscious decision. And one of the biggest mistakes people make is they think of giving up those attractions as losing something, when actually, when you commit to somebody, you are gaining something. What you gain when you commit to your spouse is their trust. Suddenly you have someone that you can be 100% open and honest with. And I don't know whether you've ever thought about it, but in general, as we go through our lives, we don't tell the truth to anybody. We don't tell the complete truth to our mothers, to our children, to our friends, do we? Not a single one of them. There's always something we hold back. The one exception to that in your entire life is a committed spouse. Suddenly, if you have a committed spouse and you are working together to build a family and have children together, then that person you can be 100% honest with. And if you don't choose to do that, to commit to them, to be honest with them, and restrain those attractions, then you lose all that. And I tell you truthfully, that having that person that you can be 100% honest with is one of the best things that ever happens to you in your entire life. So the first thing is you must make a decision to commit to your spouse. Now, I admit that you can make a decision to commit to your spouse and then they go and let you down. Of course, that's just the way life is. But if you choose wisely and you make that commitment, the chances are they'll make it back. So that's the starting point. Restrain yourself, because you are going to lose something enormous if you don't. You see what I mean?
Yeah, and I like what you say. It's a commitment, really, that there will always be beautiful and more handsome people that you interact with along the way.
Yeah.
And you just have to make that decision that you can build the person you are with to be better instead of wanting. Because even when you go to the next one, there'll still be someone who will be more beautiful or more handsome or more knowledgeable along the way. So I think that's very important.
I mean, one of the big problems is that, you know, that I said a minute ago that we're always attracted to other people. It's actually worse than that. There are separate pathways in the brain for what you might call long-term attachment and what you might call infatuation. The process of falling in love with somebody is something that can go on alongside. Now, the big problem is that there's lots of chemicals involved in infatuation and people become addicted to them. They just think this is real great, you know, and as soon as the infatuation begins to fade away, they can't be bothered to go down the long-term pathway of attachment. And so they just go out and find someone else to get infatuated with. Now, with all due respect to everybody, that's no life. I mean, it might be very, very exciting, but it's closer to sort of drug addiction than love, if you see what I mean. Go on.
in practice, we found people who is true, they continued and they realized they just can't find. It's like they don't even know now what they're looking for. So because they found one person who was attractive, even slept with them, then they found the attraction disappeared and they actually end up being frustrated. So at the end of the day, you thought it's going to bring you happiness, but then because of that comparison, you never quite get there. So at the end of the day, you are not even happy, despite all the other challenges that it brings your way.
You know, life's complicated, and interestingly, there are a lot of groups in society that are particularly troubled by this. I'd like you to think about the people who live their lives surrounded by young people. Now, university staff would be a good example of this. If a university lecturer divorces, the chances of he or she remarrying are much lower than normal, because of course they are comparing people of their own age with 19 and 20-year-old students. And I think you can imagine the comparison doesn't look too good. So it is one of those things we have to make decisions about in our lives, that we are going to choose a spouse very carefully, somebody who we can really build trust with, and we're going to use that as a launching pad for the next part of our lives. And we leave all that excitement of the romance and what have you that you do when you're a teenager and in your early 20s. We leave it behind us. If you don't make that conscious decision, then life can just go on being exciting, yes, but eventually empty. And that's not a place you want to go.
Wow. And so then someone asks, what do you do then if this partner of yours keep finding other people attracted and gets into their relationships on and off and continuously and apologizes? How do you handle that continuous unfaithfulness?
You know, most affairs are accidents, and they're not, if you like, part of the character of the person you're married to. It's just happened. They come back to you, they apologize, the two of you sit and talk about why it happened. There's an acknowledgement on both parties that things were wrong in the relationship and you put them right. That situation leads to much deeper relationships. It's almost, I hate to say this, it sounds ridiculous, but it's almost a necessary part of really building a deep relationship, is to recognize that you have to support one another in avoiding being unfaithful, and that it's really possible for any human being to be unfaithful just by accident, just by happening to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But then there is another group in society. There are people who don't have any intention of being faithful. Now, obviously people have a tendency to think that it's always the men who do this. It's not. There are plenty of women who lead the same strategy. Although I will confess that there are probably more men who do it. And the reason for that, of course, is obvious when you think about it. Every time a man has sex with a woman, there is the possibility of having a child. And so men are, if you like, biologically driven to try and have lots and lots of partners. And there are just a few people, men in society, for whom that is their strategy in life. And they are the people who are a total nightmare if you ever get into any form of relationship with them, because they have no intention of being faithful to you. Their aim is to have their wicked way with you and move on. But unfortunately, some of them decide to get married along the way, but they carry on with their strategy. Now, the truth of the matter is, early on, as you get to know somebody, you need to know whether that's their strategy in life. And the simplest way of deciding is, have they been unfaithful before? Yes. Are they being unfaithful again? Yes. Then there comes a point where you have to say, I think this person has no intention of being faithful to me, and I would be wiser to end the relationship and find someone who is prepared to be faithful.
So
does that
probably
make sense?
That at the beginning, some of these things would probably be noticed at the beginning if you were we took our time when we were relating earlier on. Was probably one of the mistakes some of us make is
And you know, it's a very sad thing, but I mean, most of us have this idea that relationships are very precious things and very hard. And so we don't look hard enough for our partner. And in particular, we're not critical enough as we meet somebody. But the truth of the matter is that when you first get to know somebody, they always leak into the conversation all the clues which tell you what a relationship is going to be like with them. So you should have your ears and eyes wide open long before you get into the, oh, I'm in love, and so I stop noticing all their faults stage. You should know, even in the first hour or two of your relationship, whether this person is someone you can really build a relationship with. We should do this. We should really put a lot of effort into watching for the signs that say that this person is not going to be trustworthy. You know, everybody's heard of red flags, the things that tell you that this person's a disaster. I like to talk about pink flags, which are the lots of little things. We've all got one or two of them, but the lots of little things that warn you that this person is not safe. So, for example, you might go out for a meal together and they are so nice to you, but they're rude to the waiter. Now, that should tell you something. Maybe that'll be you in a few months' time. Or they just aren't quite open enough with you. You know, they are telling you things that you realize are not true, or they're leaving things out. Maybe they're never going to be truthful with you. Or maybe they don't keep their promises. They say to you they're going to meet you at such and such a time, and they're late. I tell you truthfully, if a man is late for a date, then there's something seriously wrong. Okay, he might have a really good excuse, but he can't have excuses like that for every date. So we should watch for these little signs that this person we're with is not reliable, has issues that we don't know about. It's not worth going on any further. And it's worth bearing in mind the thought that it's easier to leave a relationship early than later. So the split second you begin to realize that this person is not a very nice person to be with, just go. Just leave straight away and find somebody else. Don't waste your time.
I think the concern here now is that I've already made the mistake, haven't done a good background check, or ignored the clues, and here I am 15 years down the line. What's the hope for me?
Well, I mean, I'm a great optimist. I think that whatever it was that drew you together in the first place must have been something worth having. So even 15 years down the line and things have gone really pear-shaped, there is always the possibility of putting things back on track. But first of all, you've got to want to do it. You've got to decide that you don't want to continue in this unhappy place. And I know this is going to sound awful, but you've got to contemplate leaving. Because, for example, if you want to start disputing the behavior of your spouse, if you aren't prepared to leave, then you don't have a negotiating position. Your spouse maybe has figured out over the years that you're too scared to leave. So you have to get to a place where if the negotiation with your spouse doesn't work, you are willing to go. Now, when you've got to that place and you say to your spouse, let's fix a time, I want to talk about some of the things that are making me unhappy, you could start a process where everything gets put back on track. And so do it. And if you are the sort of person who finds conflict difficult, or you find it difficult to have that conversation with your spouse, get someone else involved. Get a counselor to sit with you and be a mediator or be a moderator and help you develop the skills together of dealing with your conflict. And then there's always a chance then of putting things right.
Wow, quite informative there. And I'm hoping that we are learning and we are telling ourselves there's hope. I think the most important thing we want to talk about is hope, that you don't have to stay with so bad, but again, you don't have to walk out just because you're struggling. You can look for help, and help is available. And maybe one other issue that, especially in the interest of time, that we want to talk about is emotions. Because of these disagreements, there are a lot of emotions that are expressed in relationship. And one person says shouting, screaming, banging, smashing, repetitive, loud accusatory statements. And the question is, how do you handle this? Because then at one point people can get physical if this is not handled well, and that's closely related to one where someone is saying the spouse gets a temper every time there are emotional issues. So I think it's about emotions being expressed in a marriage. Why is it so, and how can they be assisted to handle the emotions better?
Right. First thing to note is that emotions are much more important in a relationship than any other part of our lives. I mean, most of us interact with a lot of people in our lives, and we don't let our emotions get in the way. We don't shout at our boss. We don't shout at policemen. We don't, generally speaking, shout at our mothers or the pastor on a Sunday. So why do we do it to our wives or our husbands? The answer, of course, is that in that relationship, there's more at stake. There is a subtext that you're fighting with me, you're disputing with me. That means you don't love me. And so, of course, all our relationship fears come out to the surface, and we start to get defensive, and lots of people get defensive in quite unfortunate ways, like getting angry. So the first thing to do is to recognize that if you're going to get into a conflict discussion with your spouse, then the emotional temperature is going to rise. So the right approach is the one I was talking about earlier. First of all, don't ambush. If you raise a difficult subject at an unexpected time with your spouse, expect a bad reaction. So instead, don't do that. Say very calmly to your spouse, I'd like us to talk about this, that, and the other. When would be a good time for you? And you fix a time, and then you spend a little bit of time defining what it is you're going to talk about. And you go through that routine I described of meeting in a place where it's businesslike. And if there is a risk of real anger and temper and all the rest of it, maybe that had better be a public place. Maybe you'd better have that conversation in a second-rate coffee shop or something, not your favorite coffee shop, but the other one, the sleazy one around the corner. Or maybe you go for a walk in Karura, you know, or just down the street for that matter, because strangely enough, people don't get as angry when they're walking and moving. So think about how you're going to manage that conversation and choose the right time and the right venue. And then in the background, make sure that you are making the rest of your time together into a pleasant conversation. There really is a good rule of thumb here that 80% plus of all of the conversations that should be going on between a man and a wife should be a good conversation, a happy conversation. Now, if you are worried about some issues and you just don't know how to raise them and the temperature is very, very high, maybe you just park them completely for a week, a fortnight, a month, and you get back into the habit of being nice to one another. And when that's gone on for a little while, then you could say, look, I'd like us to talk about this, that, and the other. Can we set a time to do it? And by now, the temperature has fallen. And so people are able to approach that conversation. It could be, of course, that you're talking about somebody who's really has difficulties managing their emotions. Now, that's another case for professional help. Psychologists have brilliant tools available to help people control their emotional temperature, to help them experience anger without getting hot and bothered and violent. And so if your partner habitually has difficulty with their emotions, then involve a third party. And I hate to say this could be one of those areas where there may be some personality issues. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that personality issues are spectrum disorders. They range from the very mild to the very serious. And again, having a professional talk to you and do an assessment of what's going on can help you decide whether it's going to be possible to deal with this situation or not. And that advice alone might be priceless.
Wow, I don't know whether, Sophie, you're seeing a lot of emotional problems, like negative expression of emotions in your clinical practice, and what of form of therapies you're giving to these people, just in brief.
Yes, well, they're there. And really, it's like I was saying before, trying to understand why we react the way we do, trying to understand even how we were socialized to emote, how we were taught to love and be kind or be angry, you know, because sometimes even just highlighting that really, really helps turn things around. Because some people come in saying, I don't want to be like so and so, you know, depending on how they grew up. And so sometimes that realization that that's a path they're going down just helps them turn around things. At the same time, then it's also a matter of learning how to manage and regulate our emotions better. Thinking of it like a thermometer, for instance, you know, trying to understand how your body reacts. So how do you know you're angry? Bringing that awareness. So then there's what people see. Maybe we all see the Hulk, and you've never realized that you get that flustered, or you get that angry, or you get that scary. And also just trying to highlight that. So when you're angry, what do you think happens and what really happens? Even just getting people to keep a log of their emotions and their thoughts and their behaviors within a week or two, and you know, being dedicated to that process. So listing on the 17th of February, this was the situation, this is how I reacted, and so on and so forth. And sometimes when they see that in black and white and realize, oh my good Lord, I have a problem, you know, then they are now dedicated to working at managing their emotions better. And the fact of the matter is, Doc, is that there's nothing wrong with getting angry. It's a genuine human emotion, right? It's when it goes overboard that we get concerned.
Yes.
Sometimes I even tell people, think of when you get into an accident, like that's just classic, a traffic accident, and just see how quick that situation can escalate. Because then so and so has rammed into you. They claim that you know, had brakes and your brake lights are not working. Blame game, you know, back and forth, back and forth. And sometimes those fender benders can become a, a situation where someone is paying for someone else's blood. But then if one of those people actually said, okay, let's start again, you know, just taking that few seconds to stop the conversation from getting too heated, and you know, realizing I'm shaking, I can feel my heartbeat, I can feel my temples throbbing, you know, and being able to regulate themselves, then that situation can easily be solved in an amicable fashion rather than waiting for the cops to come and abstract and whatnot. So even just helping people come to that realization of how does my body react for certain emotions is very important. And then realizing that it's okay to have all these different emotions, negative and positive, because that's how we are built. The point is, how do we then deal with them? How do we get to a place where we're not causing harm to someone else and we're maintaining safety in our situations?
Thank you very much. And there are still very many questions, and I know we will not answer all of them, but we want to really continue appreciating that you've continued to share with us. And I want to let this attendee who said that their husband divorced them after 30 years, married a younger wife, they are sick, and now they have no savings, and they think that they have reached the end of life. Kindly, maybe you can send us just privately, you can send us your number and we will reach out to you, so that we because that is very, very personal and may not be addressed in this setting. Then we would like to end this like in the next 10 minutes, but maybe Dr. Chris, you can quickly talk about two things. One is finances as a cause of conflict in
Right.
families, and there are a lot of questions about the emotions being expressed when finances are down. And the other thing is the role of the extended family. One person saying that the husband says, I married for you, not for my family, so you must not interact with them. And the others is because the family members are the ones who are making decisions. Like you find maybe a husband, sister is the one whose opinion is listened to instead of the wife. So two things: finances and the family, the extended family, and how to handle that so that they don't become a source of conflict
Okay.
in our marriages.
Okay, well, let's start with finances. I mean, money is a curious thing. Arguments about money in relationships are usually actually not about money. They're really about control. And so it can get very, very heated. People have very odd ideas about money. Everybody is different about money, and the likelihood of two people getting married and having exactly the same approach to money is very small. So one of the best things that couples can do is, as soon as they begin to realize that they are serious about one another and they're beginning to think about a life together, they should start to explore their attitudes towards money and their thoughts and plans for the future. And they should start the process of being open with one another about their income, their spending, their debts, and so on. Because it's a strange thing, but that conversation often goes very well between fiancés. But then if you try to open up the same conversation 10 years later, it's a nightmare. So that's my first thought, is that if you are in the process of getting married, start talking about money straight away. The second thing is that money is a difficult area because people, frankly, it's the area where they're most likely to lie. It's amazing how difficult people find it to admit to all of their income, all of their investments, all of their debts and spending and all the rest of it. So try, as you get into your relationship, to start a process of being completely honest about money. I could tell you endless horror stories about money issues in relationships. The sort of situation where the husband's been busy stashing money away and then he dies, and then of course the wife doesn't even know it exists, and all sorts of crazy things happen, and before long it's all in the courts, and 20 years later it still hasn't been resolved. Those sorts of things happen. So the first thing is, in a perfect world, start talking about money early. In a less than perfect world, start talking about it now. And recognize how difficult it is to have a conversation about money. So try to have a conversation about honesty first. Try to have a conversation in which you agree that you're going to be completely honest, and ask yourself questions about where might the roadblocks be in being completely honest with one another. And then if you are able to be completely honest, then start the conversation about all your plans and ideas about money, and things will go better. Now, I'll elaborate on that if you like, but let's go for a bit onto the extended family. Again, the problem with the extended family is best handled before you get married. You know, I don't know if you ever thought about it, but there's that wonderful verse in Genesis which talks about, therefore shall a man leave his family and cleave to his wife. And I wonder if you've ever thought about that, because what it really means is that when it says a man, I mean, that's just the way they wrote in those days. What it really means is that when anyone is thinking about getting married, they have got to be fully functioning adults who are able to leave their family of origin and start a new one, putting everything in that new family first. And that obviously that's something that's been known for thousands of years, and yet every generation has to learn it again. The fact is that when you start a marriage, you have to put your spouse first, which means that your old family has to come second. And in general, both they, the family members, and ourselves find that really difficult to do. Hence all the mother-in-law issues, you know, where the man is devoted to his mother and is still somehow putting her first in front of his wife. Or the whole thing could be reversed, of course. Or the never-ending useless cousins that you're still supporting after all these years. You know, you can picture all the usual things. The solution is always the same. A husband and wife have to build a wall around themselves, and they have to promise that everything they talk about inside that wall is utterly confidential. They don't tell their family, and they make sure that the pair of them are completely on the same page about their families before they interact with anyone else in the extended family. Now, if you do that, there's a very good chance that you will solve extended family issues. But if you aren't ready to do that, then maybe you're not ready to get married. And so obviously the roots of this particular problem go right back to when you were a young person. And if you aren't ready to put your spouse first, you're not ready to get married.
Thank you so much. And you know, even as we come to the end of this, I feel like we cannot exhaust these discussions. But the one thing that I want you, Dr. Chris, to talk about is the issue of sickness, especially when it affects the relationship, because there is no longer sex in that relationship. And someone is saying, right, then someone becomes frustrated and is angry. How do they go about that? I feel like that's very sensitive, and they'll appreciate the answer.
You know, you've just raised an enormously difficult subject. I mean, first of all, you remember the words of the marriage service, which talks about for better, for worse, in sickness and health, and so on. When you marry somebody, you are making a commitment to look after that person, and they are making a commitment to look after you, regardless. Now, I know in a perfect world, we all do that. In a less than perfect world, lots of people struggle to do that, and it is very understandable. Think about why it is that divorce, for example, has the pattern that it does. Most divorces occur between childless couples who've only been married a short while. And the reason is it's relatively cost-free to leave a relationship like that. And so if our subconscious decides that things are not working out well in our relationship, then they start to make us fall out and we part. Now, as time goes by and you have a bigger and bigger investment together in the relationship, like there are children, there's property, and so on and so on, it gets more and more important that you actually say to yourself, I am committed to this relationship, come what may. And yes, I do hear people say, oh, you know, my spouse is not well, we're no longer intimate, and so on. I think this is the point at which you have to start asking yourself, what are the real priorities in life? Because sex is more than just getting hot and sweaty and naked between the sheets. It's also about affection and caring and support and touch and all the other things that can actually be vastly more important than all that excitement when you were 25 years old. So I think I'm at risk at sounding more like a preacher than a psychologist, but the reality is that it's all about the values that you bring to a marriage and deciding for yourself what are the most important things you're doing. And by the time a couple has been together for a few years and there are children and so on, the real purpose of that marriage is about rearing the children. And so if your spouse is unwell, then I'm afraid it's your duty to stay with them and look after them, even though that might come at a considerable cost.
Wow. People, you'll agree with me that this topic is quite close to all of us, because whether you're married or you're single, there's some relationship around you. And especially for us adults, even if you're single, most likely you've had a relationship. But the one good thing, and from Chris and Sophie's discussion, is that one, there are things that can be done. And I kept listening to Chris, and one of the things that coming out is the talking. So communication, very, very core to relationships. And Dr. Hart, I know we would love to continue listening because there's so much that can be said. But people are asking, where can they get you, and what does it cost to see you? So I'll give you just a minute or two to give any closing remarks, especially given what we have been talking about, and to tell people where help can be found to see you specifically, and what other opportunities people have to seek help on relationships in this country and abroad.
Okay. I mean, fortunately, times are changing and a lot more help is available. It used to be that there were practically no psychologists or counselors in Kenya, but that's not true anymore. There's a lot. People who want to speak to me specifically, just Google my name, Chris Hart, psychologist, Kenya, will find all my details. I have a website, a Facebook page, Instagram, they're all very findable. So just go to them and pick up my profile. If your memory totally fails you, just buy the Sunday Nation, and my email address is at the bottom of every article. So just get in touch. And anybody who does contact me, of course, I'll give them all the details about how I operate. These days, I do everything online. I've discovered one way or another that it's actually a really good way to do counseling. People are, I don't know, 5 years ago, if I suggested to someone we did a video counseling session, I got a lot of resistance. Now people have discovered that it's actually a very pleasant and almost more intimate way to talk about your problems than actually meeting face to face. Somehow people feel safer talking to a computer screen than they do going into somebody's office. I know that sounds awful when you say it quickly, but it's a fact. People do. And it's especially useful in a situation like COVID and in a situation where people are moving around a lot. Lots of people contact me. I know this sounds weird, but they call me from their cars, they call me on their holidays, they call me on business trips. So it works. So yes, just Google, just go to my website, pick up my details, and I'll be very happy to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chris. And I don't know, Sophie, whether you have any other final comments for us as we close. And also tell us, where can you be found and what are the other sources that you know of? Well, Chris wants us to Google. What can we do for you?
Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. If you just look for the tagline Mambo Akili, you'll find me. Or psychosocial support services. I think for me, I always come away with something out of our webinars every week, and it's so exciting just to be able to have these conversations, and we can never exhaust issues to do with relationships. So the one word I'm walking out of this with is choice, right? We have the liberty to choose. We are choosing to be deliberately in such relationships. We're choosing to be with our partners every day. Every day you wake up and you're actually making that choice to be with that partner. And for me, that has come out quite strongly from Dr. Hart's discussions. And I think if I can just make one suggestion in terms of what to do, we can never also talk about self-care enough, I think. And I always try and encourage people to come up with a self-care plan when you're okay, when you're not in a distressed mode, things are not bad, things are actually, you're having a smooth time in your life. Develop a self-care plan, a holistic one, physically, psychologically, emotionally, socially speaking, financially, professionally, categorize it and actually come up with a plan for yourself that is unique to you. Because what happens is when you develop it now, when you are going through a difficult time and you've actually developed it and implemented it, it becomes very easy to tap into it as a resource. And it helps you ride that wave a bit better. So even when it's tough stuff to do with your relationship, self-care is very important, because then I know they joke happy wife, happy life, but why not give it a go? Why not ensure that you as a wife, you as a girlfriend, you're happy, you as a husband or a boyfriend, you're happy, you're in a good space, because it emanates out of you, and you get to touch the people around you in a very special way. So I think coming out of tonight, choice and self-care. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Hart, for your nuggets of wisdom, and Dr. Kwoba as well for your wonderful moderation. And for all of you who've sent in questions and comments, I trust that you also walk away tonight with something that you can take home.
Thank you so much. And to also do another Thanksgiving is Joy Mugambi. I know there's so much we could continue saying, but Joy, I know you contributed significantly to have us having Chris, and we thank you because we are not disappointed. Please say something and close on behalf of all the associations that are represented here tonight. Joy, I hope you're there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kwoba, and thank you very much, Dr. Chris Hart. It's been a while since I saw you. Good enough. Dr. Chris is my psychologist, and I keep telling people you need to have a psychologist to keep you in check and to ensure that things are going right and for your own success. So this was an awesome session, and we look forward to having you here with us over and over again. Dr. Kwoba, thank you very much for that wonderful moderation. Then Sophie, you're always with us, and it's an honor to have you here with us. Dr. Chris, all the way from the UK, that's really an honor. And within a very short time, you could be able to log in and be with us. We really, truly appreciate. For our members, KMA, CPAC, KCOA, and also the Kenya Psychiatric Association, and all other associations that have collaborated in these mental health webinars, we thank you so much. The questions have really raised issues that are really pertinent, but what I take home and what even I'll be talking with my children days to come is set your base early. Start talking early, and do not delay in terms of all these nitty-gritty discussions in terms of money, financing, ensuring that you're running your lives well before even you enter into your marriage. Thank you so much. We appreciate you. Back to you, Kwoba.
Thank you very much, everyone. We can't continue saying thank you because we will be here. And please, if your question was not answered, please take note that we've taken it into account, and we are going to make sure that we raise a webinar that discusses the specific issues of communication, issues of reconciliation. We noted that, we didn't address that. Building trust. Again, those are things that we have taken note of. So, and even for young people who are getting into relationship, I feel like there'll be more that we need to do. So we thank you, and remember what we said when we started. It's healthcare workers for healthcare workers, ensuring that all of us remain healthy. And remember the call center, please call in, seek help. Even if not at the call center, talk to someone. Google Dr. Chris, look for Sophie, but talk to someone, whoever it is. Just don't die alone. Hope is available. Thank you very much. Until next Tuesday, when we have another discussion, God bless you. Have a lovely night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, and thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Finished.
Finished.